Winter had come early to Montana. By mid-November, the ground was already sealed in a crust of frost so hard it rang beneath a boot heel. Snow had begun to fall in steady, relentless flurries that didn't melt even under the weak midday sun. The trees stood bare and silent, branches heavy with white weight. The wind moved through the hills like something alive, sharp-edged and whispering. Elinor Brady had known the cold was coming long before it reached the land. It had settled in the house after her husband's death, a slow, creeping chill that no fire could warm. He had fallen from his horse on the ridge in late September, neck broken clean on the rocks below. They had buried him near the edge of the property, a simple wooden cross marked with his initials, and then she had turned back toward the house he had grown up in, clinging to the only ties she had left. His family had not asked her to stay, nor had they asked her to leave. They had endured her presence, the way one might tolerate a draft beneath a door that refused to close properly. Meals were eaten in silence. Her mother-in-law's gaze was sharp, expressionless. The boy, Jonas, only 5, had sensed it too. His voice quieter, his movement slower. He no longer reached for the skirts of his grandmother, no longer laughed in the barn. He simply clung to Elinor, his small hand in hers, watching, waiting. It was a Tuesday evening when Elinor understood fully. The house had been too still. The fire had burned low, and even the usual sounds of movement, dishes, footsteps, the shuffle of chairs, had fallen away. She had stepped into the kitchen and seen her mother-in-law by the window, staring out at the snow with her lips pressed into a hard line. Her eyes met Elinor's only briefly, but the cold in them was unmistakable. No words were exchanged. None were needed. They did not want her. They did not want Jonas. He had not slept that night.
Instead, she packed quietly, carefully, what little clothing they had into a single bag. She wrapped Jonas in layers, pulled his wool cap down over his ears, and tied her own scarf tight around her face. She left a note by the hearth, brief, apologetic, unnecessary. Then, just before first light, she took her son by the hand and stepped out into the snow. They moved northwest toward the hills. Elinor had heard of a place once, an old hunter's station near the abandoned mail road, built back in the days when trapping was still worth the risk. It might have collapsed by now, swallowed by snow and time, but she had nothing else, no other direction. The road behind her led only to silence and Jonas walked beside her, his boots crunching softly in the snow. He didn't ask where they were going. He didn't speak at all. The cold numbed their fingers, bit at their faces, made every breath a shallow ache.
Elinor pressed forward, eyes scanning the pale horizon, each step driven not by certainty but by the raw, insistent need to leave. There was no promise in the journey, no guarantee, only the knowledge that behind her waited a house that was no longer home, and ahead, something else, maybe nothing, maybe ruin, but maybe, just maybe, a place to stop, to breathe, to survive the winter. That hope, thin and stubborn, was enough to keep her feet moving through the snow. The snow did not stop. It fell in a constant, heavy silence that muffled the world, turning everything into shifting shades of white and gray. The sky remained low and colorless, as though it had collapsed toward the earth. Elinor Brady moved through the drifts with slow, deliberate steps, her arms wrapped tightly around her son. Jonas no longer asked questions. He no longer looked around with the wide eyes of a child trying to make sense of unfamiliar things. He leaned into her without a sound, his head pressed against her collarbone, his breath warm against her neck. During the day, they walked. Elinor guided them through patches of pine, across frozen creek beds, and along barely visible trails that the snow had begun to erase. Her boots broke through the crust again and again, her legs aching with every step. At night, they found what shelter they could, beneath low branches, behind fallen logs, under the sweeping arms of snow-laden firs. She would clear a space, spread a blanket, and curl herself around Jonas, tucking his small frame into the warmth of her body. The cold always crept in anyway. She rationed their food with care. Dried meat, a heel of bread, a strip of hard cheese, enough for another day or two at most. She forced herself to eat only when Jonas did, though hunger gnawed at her with increasing sharpness. Water came from melted snow. Her fingers, red and cracked, grew numb from cupping it over the fireless stones she arranged each night in mock attempts at comfort. She had hoped the journey would be shorter. She had hoped for more strength in her limbs, more distance between herself and the house she had left behind. On the third day, the clouds began to thin, but the snow still fell in slow, deliberate flurries. The forest had grown thicker, and the path more uncertain. Elinor's steps ass-cap. She would clear a space, spread a blanket, and curl herself around Jonas, tucking his small frame into the warmth of her body. The cold always crept in anyway. She rationed their food with care.
Jonas barely stirred now, even when she adjusted him in her arms. She feared that he was slipping beneath the cold's weight, retreating somewhere she could not reach. Then, just before dusk, something broke the endless repetition of tree and snow and sky. A shape, unnatural, almost indistinguishable in the fading light. She stopped, heart racing. It was a structure, set back between the trees, low to the ground, with a roof that sagged under snow. One side had partially collapsed inward. The windows were black and empty, but a chimney still stood at one end. The faintest line of smoke curled from it. She approached slowly, her breath shallow, watching the shape come into clearer focus. The building was made of rough-hewn logs. Taking a parent's countries as and arrive.
Then came a sharp metallic sound, the distinct click of a rifle being drawn and readied. She froze. Footsteps followed. Measured, slow. A figure emerged from the shadows just inside the doorway. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a faded army coat and a dark hat pulled low over his brow. Snow clung to his sleeves and boots. His eyes found hers quickly, then flicked down to Jonas, limp in her arms. He did not raise the rifle. He only looked at them for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he stepped back into the house, leaving the door open behind him. Elinor did not hesitate. Her legs moved on instinct, carrying her through the threshold into the dim interior. The air smelled of ash, old wood, and cold iron. She stepped inside, holding her son tighter, her eyes adjusting to the flickering glow of a fire not yet fully stoked. Whatever lay ahead, it was warmer than the snow. And for now, that was enough. Matt Caulfield had lived alone for 3 years. Since the war had ended and the graves of his wife and son had been closed beneath frost-hardened earth, he had turned his back on the world and taken up residence in the old trapper's cabin nestled at the foot of the hill. It had once belonged to a man he'd known briefly, now long gone. The walls leaned inward with age, and the floor groaned in the night, but the place stood firm against snow and wind. It was enough. He had made no plans to share it. He needed no one and expected nothing. His days were shaped by the rhythm of necessity, chopping wood, repairing tools, checking the lines he set for rabbits near the creek bed. When he was not working, he sat near the fire, whittling or staring into the flames without purpose. Time had softened nothing in him. It had only made silence more familiar. Then, Elinor Brady had stepped into his doorway, the child clutched in her arms, eyes dark with cold and fear. He had seen enough to understand she had nowhere else to go. He had not spoken. He had made no introductions. He simply moved aside. She had not asked for more than a space near the hearth. She had not wept or pleaded. In that, perhaps, he had recognized something of himself. He gave them what he could spare, a chunk of bread, coarse and hard-edged, a blanket warm but clean, a place where the fire burned hottest, and then he returned to his chair, letting them be. She did not ask questions either. He had expected her to, but she didn't. She moved quietly, even in her exhaustion. She kept the boy close, tending to him with the kind of focus born from desperation. When he began to cough, low, rasping sounds that didn't stop even as he slept, Matt noticed the way her hands trembled as she held him. Still, she asked for nothing.
On the second evening, as the wind howled just beyond the snow stacked itself against the windowsills, Matt opened a narrow drawer and retrieved a small glass bottle. The liquid inside was a deep golden brown. Cedar root and horehound, remnants of an old remedy passed down from someone he could no longer name. He had not used it in years. He placed it at the head of the cot where the boy slept and returned to his seat by the fire. Elinor saw. She met his gaze briefly, her eyes worn and glassy with fatigue, then nodded once, wordlessly. The silence between them remained. It was not uncomfortable, not yet familiar, but balanced, like the space between two sides of an untouched field. Elinor made herself useful without instruction. She melted snow in a dented tin pot, stirred the coarse oats he kept stored in a sack, cereals, by this ear, azalea nails, clothes, and poles.
Matt watched, though he never offered to help. Not because he didn't care, but because he sensed she needed the doing, needed to feel capable, needed to prove to herself that she could still care for her child without depending on the charity of a stranger. He let her have that. The house felt different with others in it. Not louder, not exactly warmer either, but changed. The firelight fell differently across the walls. The air carried a new rhythm. The sound of the boy's breathing, the quiet scrape of a spoon in a tin bowl, the soft rustle of blankets being adjusted in the night. Matt moved more carefully now, not because he was unsure, but because he sensed the weight of something fragile in the air. Weakness, not pity, but something like a thread strung between 3 people who had not chosen to be together, yet were now bound by need in the cold press of winter. Elinor rarely looked at him. When she did, it was not with suspicion nor with trust, but with the wariness of someone who had learned that even kindness could carry a cost. He did not falter for it. He offered her only what he could: silence, space, and the fire. It was enough for now. The days passed with a slow, deliberate stillness. each one folding into the next without fanfare or distinction. Outside, the snow deepened. It no longer fell in chaotic flurries, but in a steady, weighty blanket that pressed down on the world. Paths disappeared, fences vanished beneath drifts, and the land surrendered to white. The road, if it could still be called that, was long buried. Nothing came in, nothing went out. Inside the cabin, time took on its own rhythm. There were no clocks, only the fire's breathing and the shifts in light through the frost-blurred window. Elinor and Jonas stayed. There was no discussion of leaving. There was nowhere to go. They shared the silence. It was no longer edged with fear or unfamiliarity, but had softened into something companionable. Matt worked in his quiet way, steady and focused. He carried in stacks of firewood each morning, stacking them neatly along the wall. He split logs outside in the brittle air, the sound of the axe a slow and measured punctuation to the day. When his hands were too stiff for that, he worked indoors, mending old fishing lines, oiling a rusted trap, sewing up the torn sleeve of a shirt too worn to replace. Jonas had begun to watch him. At first, the boy only peered at him from across the room, half curled beneath a blanket, eyes alert but unsure. But over time, the staring gave way to quiet observation, then to curiosity. Elinor noticed it, the way Jonas began to draw again, using a chunk of charcoal and a piece of flattened birch bark Matt had left near the hearth. He sketched the fire, a tree, the edge of a boot, simple things. Sometimes he would stand, cross the room, and hold up his work to Matt without a word. Matt never said anything in return. But one evening, when the cabin was dim and the fire low, he took one of the drawings. A room, painted of Caria, flory soldiers. When there rose an area, it leaned crookedly against an old lantern. He didn't look at Jonas as he did it, and Jonas didn't speak. But Elinor saw. She saw the way her son's shoulders straightened, the way his fingers tightened around the next piece of bark he picked up. The house was still quiet, but gestures had begun to take the place of words. A bowl of broth left cooling near Elinor's sewing basket. A second blanket folded beside Jonas without explanation. A broken buckle replaced on her bag without anyone mentioning it. Elinor moved through the space differently now. Not as a guest, not quite as an inhabitant, but as someone slowly easing into the edges of belonging. The cabin did not welcome easily, and she had not asked for welcome. But she had begun to know its sounds, its smells, its patterns, the way the wind pressed against the northern wall, the way the fire crackled louder when fed spruce instead of pine. She swept the floor each morning without thinking. She added snow to the pot without waiting to be asked. Still, the unease did not fully leave her. It lingered in the corners, quiet but persistent. She did not know how long the snow would last. She did not know what Matt expected, and though he asked for nothing, the silence still felt like something she needed to interpret, as if beneath it lay a decision yet unspoken. The fear was no longer about immediate danger. It was the quieter, deeper fear of not knowing when or if they would be told to go. But for now, there was only the firelight and the slow ticking of winter. And in that hush, in that strange in-between space of waiting, Elinor found something that almost resembled peace. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of it. The blizzard came in the first days of January, sudden and absolute. It descended from the mountains with a howl that seemed to rise from the earth itself, filling the sky with white rage. The wind battered the cabin with relentless force, whistling through the smallest cracks, shaking the roof beams until it felt as if the whole structure might split apart and disappear into the snow. Daylight no longer mattered. The sky remained a uniform gray, the storm blotting out even the suggestion of a sun. The world outside ceased to exist. Inside, the fire became the center of everything. Matt fed it constantly, breaking apart what remained of the larger logs and rationing the last bundles of kindling. He slept little, his body moving on habit, waking every hour to check the stove, to press his palm to the floorboards, to listen for the moan of wind that never stopped. The cabin creaked and groaned like a living thing in pain. Snow began to pile against the door, sealing them in.
Jonas grew sick again. It started with a small cough, dry and sharp. Then came the fever, slow but steady, settling into his small body with a weight that Elinor could not lift. She sat beside him hour after hour, wiping his forehead with melted snow, whispering words that had no shape. The boy's skin burned beneath her hand. His breathing turned shallow, the rasp in his chest deepened. Elinor stopped sleeping. She hovered over him with the kind of attention that bordered on desperation, her own body slowly unraveling from exhaustion, her thoughts fractured, spiraling around old fears and fresh helplessness. The storm had cut them off completely. There would be no help, no chance of going for medicine, no traveler to stumble across them, no light in the distance. It was sometime deep in the second night when she felt a hand on her shoulder. She didn't hear him approach. She didn't know how long he had been standing there.
Matt placed something warm in her hand. A small pot, the metal surface radiating heat, the faint scent of milk and herbs rising from it. Her fingers trembled, and without speaking, he gently closed her hand around the handle, steadying her grip. The warmth seeped through her skin like a slow balm. She didn't cry at first, not until the sound of his footsteps receded slightly and the silence settled around them again, thick but not empty. Then it came, quietly, a sound pulled from some locked room inside her. The tears fell, not in a torrent but in waves, slow and unshaped. They came without shame, without apology. It wasn't fear that broke her, not the storm or the cold. It was the simple act of not having to be strong for a moment, of letting go, just briefly, in the presence of someone who didn't turn away. Matt didn't speak. He didn't move far. He sat in the chair near the cot, close enough to reach if needed, far enough to leave space. He watched the fire, the way the flames moved across the wood, the way the shadows danced along the walls. Outside, the wind screamed against the cabin, but inside, a different kind of quiet settled. Elinor's shoulders shook. She held the pot of milk like it was something sacred, something anchoring her to the present. She cried because it had all been too much, and because for the first time since the beginning, she wasn't alone in it. Matt stayed through the night, not as a protector, not as a savior, but simply as someone who understood what silence could carry. He said nothing. He offered nothing more than his presence, and in that, there was something steady, something that, in the midst of collapse, did not yield. Spring didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly, quietly, like a guest unsure if it was welcome. The snow didn't vanish. It melted in stages, first around the edges of the trees, then along the path to the well, then finally beneath the eaves of the cabin, where drips gathered and fell with soft, steady rhythm. The wind lost its bite. The air carried a different weight, a looseness that hadn't been there before, and in the mornings the smell of wet earth rose faint but unmistakable. Jonas was the first to feel it. He no longer curled near the fire as he once had. His steps, once cautious, grew louder, bolder. He ventured outside again, first for minutes, then for hours. The snow around the porch turned to slush, dark with soil and scattered pine needles. He jumped over puddles, poked at thawing roots, chased the shadow of birds through patches of sunlight. The child who had grown silent in winter began to hum again under his breath. Elinor no longer counted the days. She stopped marking them in her mind, stopped measuring how long it had been since the night they had arrived. There was no need. The passing of time no longer felt like a march forward or a tether to something behind. It simply was. Mornings blurred into afternoons, afternoons into evenings. She rose early, gathered snow less often, and found herself listening more closely to the shift in wind, the groan of the thawing roof, the sound of Jonas's laughter returning in fits and fragments. One evening, near dusk, Matt was on the roof replacing a few of the broken shingles. The light struck the side of the cabin at an angle that made everything golden and soft. Elinor stood near the well, a bundling in her arms, watching him. His movements were careful, practiced, and unhurried. He worked with a kind of patience that didn't need to be seen or praised. For the first time in weeks, perhaps the side of the cabin at an angle that made everything golden and soft. Elinor stood near the well, a bundle of kindling in her arms, watching him. His softened, pacing with the chills inside of the first time beak from form, very way that ever tracteth to that eventually would they recovering. The almost same of Jonas's laughter returning in fits and fragments. One evening near dusk, Matt was on the roof replacing a few of the broken shingles. The light struck the side of the cabin at an angle that made everything golden and soft. Elinor stood near the well, a bundle of kindling in her arms, watching him. His movements were careful, practiced, and unhurried. He worked with a kind of patience that didn't need to be seen or praised. For the first time in weeks, perhaps longer to do, if not the rose taste and Nomus's laughter returning in fits and fragments. One evening near dusk, Matt was on the roof replacing a few of the broken shingles. The light struck the side of the cabin at an angle that the thought startled her, not because it was unexpected, but felt so simple, so quiet. There was no decision behind it, no declaration, just a shift, a soft weight settling into place where uncertainty used to be. The next morning, Elinor stepped outside before the sun had risen above the hills. The ground was still cold, but the top layer had softened, and her boots sank slightly into the mud. She crossed the yard and began to sort through the pile of old boards leaning against the side of the cabin. She didn't know what she was looking for exactly. A straight piece, a sturdy one, something that might become the frame of a new step, a new threshold. Her hands moved without thinking, driven not by need but by possibility. Jonas wandered up beside her, his cheeks flushed from the wind. In his hands, he held something weathered and cracked, a small, rectangular piece of wood, gray with age. He held it out to her. She turned it over in her palms. The words carved into it were faded but still clear. Cabin 3. The letters were rough, uneven, the kind made by someone with time and a knife and no audience. She looked at Jonas, then back at the sign, and then, quietly, she smiled. This place had never been promised. It wasn't hers by right or by invitation. It had been survival at first, then necessity, and only now that the snow had begun to melt, did she understand what it was becoming. It wasn't a home yet, not quite, but it was something. a clearing, a breath, a small piece of the world where she was no longer only passing through. Mac didn't say anything when he saw the sign later that day, resting near the doorway, leaning against the stone. He only nodded once as he stepped around it, continuing with his work. No words were needed. There were no confessions, no grand ending with his work. No words carved into it were faded but still clear. Cabin 3. The letters were rough, uneven, the kind made by someone with time and a knife and no audience. She looked at Jonas, then back at the sign, and then, quietly, she smiled. This place had their beings, I think. I came by it in nuance and they're used to. The six mean the only nair, the same choices, and 8, the same traces, and no more things that changes. Because it's saints man by use, to use that to use it. The same to there, in fame to sinking, the permission of Patanos and the saints. Something deeper settled, not love, not yet, but something strong enough to hold against the thaw, acceptance, presence, a quiet belonging. Sometimes being beside someone was enough. Sometimes the land that remained was all that was needed. And this, whatever it was hers. Because she had stayed, because he had let her, because they had endured the winter together, and now spring, uncertain and trembling, had found them still standing.